It's a great pleasure. Very happy to be here. As was said, I've done quite a lot of work on multidimensional measurement of poverty and social exclusion, and in that sense have a very substantial overlap of interest with the focus of OFI. But as will be the case with what I'm talking about today, pretty much all my work has been focused on the rich countries. However, the rich countries don't exist in a bubble on their own, and what happens in the OECD, which is how I'll, roughly speaking, label it, what happens in the OECD obviously has multiple implications, flows of influence in both directions, and I hope that what I have to say about that will be of interest, but also more generally, I think, because the focus of the talk and the focus of the project that I'm now relatively recently embarked on since about last September here, the focus is on a topic of really very general interest, which is the relationship between inequality and growth. So I'm going to be talking about what we know. Well, I'll tell you what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be talking about that. I'm going to be talking about what we know and where the boundaries on our knowledge are in terms of what's been happening to income inequality in the rich countries, but also how that appears to be related to what's been happening to living standards and with employment as in some sense the focus in the linkage, an important linkage in the middle that I won't actually say very much about. So the interesting thing is that in the rich world, these have been rather separated concerns. In a development context, of course, there's for a very long time been a clear recognition of the potential linkages between inequality conceived broadly, but also income inequality narrowly, and growth and prosperity for the bulk of the population. But this actually hasn't been much of a focus in the rich countries over the last, over the last 50 or 60 years. And partly because for the first part of that period, income inequality was actually very stable, and when I started studying it, the general perception was that income inequality in rich countries was very stable, and watching it change was like watching paint dry, as one American researcher at the time wrote. More recently, as you'll be well aware, there's been a very strong focus on what's been happening to income inequality in the rich countries because, as we'll talk about in some detail, there's been, in many countries, a trend of strikingly rapid increases in income inequality. But what has that meant, if anything, for living standards? What has been the relationship between income inequality and prosperity, the generation of improvements in living standards throughout the bulk of the distribution? That is now only relatively recently coming to be seen, I think, as a core concern. So as awareness increased about what was happening to income inequality, most notably in the USA and here in the UK, then the first focus of attention, if you like, was, well, what is this doing societally? What is this doing in terms of the sort of society that one is living in, and in terms of a set of social outcomes that one might be concerned with? And this is where, for example, the Wilkinson and Pickett's very influential book, The Spirit Level, made a very big impact in its claims that higher income inequality brought with it, if you like, unavoidably, a whole range of social bads. And that whatever your values and norms about income inequality in and of itself, or economic inequality more broadly, that if income inequality was higher, it was going to bring a lot of things that you were going to care about, a lot of bad things that you were going to care about. More recently, particularly since the crisis and through the slow recovery, continuing slow recovery from the crisis, there's been considerable emphasis on the notion that income inequality may actually be a barrier to robust economic growth. And that, as well as being potentially implicated in the crisis itself, for reasons that we'll talk about, that it may also be undermining the capacity to recover in a sustained way from the crisis, even in terms of aggregate growth. much less who benefits from that growth. Because obviously the other aspect of the current concern that you hear articulated all the time, including by leading politicians here and across the water, is that when there is growth, it is in some sense disproportionately going to the very top of the distribution, is captured, if you like, at the top, and is not spreading into the bulk of the distribution in the way that it might have or that one might like to see. And this is where there's very, in some sense, both academic but also political interest in this notion of the squeezed middle is a very prominent theme of late. So I'm going to talk about that. First of all, to try and, in some sense, do the sort of boring but necessary task of clarifying what it is we actually know about what's happened to income inequality. I'll come to what's happening at the very top, but also this notion of the squeezed middle. And finish with really some question marks rather than conclusions. And that's the nature of things when you're at the start of a research project rather than at the end of it, with some questions about the potential relationship between inequality growth and living standards in the rich countries. So, and I should say at the outset, I should be clear that while economic inequality is of course a very complex phenomenon, and many of you have worked long and hard to try and capture it with a whole range of indicators, and I'm enormously sympathetic to that need. Having said all that, I'm going to focus on a rather narrow concept of inequality, and that is inequality in the distribution of income as we measure it. So I'm not even going to talk about wealth, which one would very much have to, much less broaden beyond income and wealth to more comprehensive measures of lifetime income, going beyond income to encapsulate well-being and so on. I'm just going to talk about income inequality. And I think there's two at least reasons for doing that. One is that it's important to be clear that even measuring that relatively well-defined and narrow concept is problematic, but also that much of the debate, much of the concern is indeed about inequality in income, and where, in some crude sense, where the income has been going. And that's where there have been some striking changes of late. So you have to, in talking about, well, what do we know, what has happened over the last 30 years or so, it is problematic to measure the concept in a consistent way across countries and over time. And that's an obstacle that remains despite a really very substantial investment of effort into trying to improve the comparability and consistency of the measurements of income that we have available to us from surveys and from administrative statistics. So many of you may be familiar with the Luxembourg income study, which for many years has tried to bring together microdata for initially, certainly it's now extended into middle income countries, but initially for what we would generally refer to as the rich countries. So Luxembourg income studies put a lot of effort into bringing together microdata and trying to harmonize it, post hoc if you like, after the event. At European level there's been a lot of effort into trying to frame surveys that are more consistently measuring income on the, if you like, at the input stage rather than output harmonized, although the main instrument that's now used at European level, the European Community, the EU Silk apparatus, is actually, it has moved back towards sort of harmonizing data that has already been produced by surveys at national level, rather than what was tried in the 90s with the ECHP, which was harmonizing the instrument, for reasons that are sort of interesting and we can come to. But the other source of comparative data that now gets a lot of attention is the OECD has, as an institution, assembled data going back to the mid-80s, not annual but for a range of years, and tried to both have available a database, but also has put a lot of effort into analysing what's been happening to income inequality and poverty in the OECD countries over this period. And it's interesting that this has only become a focus for the OECD over the last 10 or 12 years. That they really moved away, having had an early interest in social indicators and so on back in the 70s, the OECD moved away from this sort of focus. And I think it's an interesting illustration of what is now seen to be the salience for governments and their political master, for politicians, because the OECD in some sense its imperative is to be seen to be relevant and seen to be interesting and doing things that national governments wouldn't be doing themselves or couldn't do themselves. So the fact that the OECD has oriented itself really quite centrally towards inequality and inclusive growth over the last number of years, and they're not the only ones, is I think an interesting illustration of just how central this issue about inequality and growth has come to be perceived to be. So that's a long way around saying that there are a number of alternative comparative data sets and databases, and there are national data, and in the course of a project that I was centrally involved in that ended about a year ago, funded by the European Commission, FP7, which we entitled GINI, which was Growing Inequalities Impacts. That was our clever use of the acronym. That in the course of that, we had national teams collect data country by country for as long and on an annual basis where available, and as consistently as possible. So what I'm going to show you mostly relies on that collection of national data sets, because while they may not be entirely comparable across countries, we were very confident that they were the best that one could do in terms of capturing change over time. And I should particularly put in an ad that there's two rather thick volumes from this GINI project, published and very, very well published by OUP, that are co-edited by Vimer Silverda, myself, and a number of others, where you will get in-depth analysis of these data and also of the impacts of inequality, which is something the project was centrally focused on, but I'm not going to have time to talk about. So this is the sort of, if you open up the OECD website and you say, if you Google income inequality OECD, this is the sort of thing that will pop up, which is a picture of what's happened to inequality in the US, which is that it has risen very substantially certainly since 1980, as measured by the conventional single summary indicator, the Gini coefficient, that tends to get most widely bandied about. Now, if you do a rather crude exercise, which they do, which is you simply average the Gini coefficients of the OECD countries for which the number is available for these occasional years, so you're not even weighting by the size of the country, by the population, you're just taking each observation and you're calculating a simple average, you get that lower line. Whereas you can see this average Gini coefficient, or average of Gini coefficients, increased reasonably smartly between the mid-80s and the mid-90s, and then rose, but at a slower rate, and was stable, roughly speaking, up to about the crisis. So I'm going to talk about what happened up to the crisis, as long back as we can go, and then up to the crisis, and then I'm going to talk about the crisis from 2008. So what we tried to do in this project was, apart from anything else, relate what was happening in terms of income inequality as a key driver of social and political outcomes, to relate that to the standard categorization of countries in terms of welfare regimes, which you'll I'm sure be familiar with. So this is what was this is the pattern that we got from 1980 for what often get labeled, put together as the Anglo-Saxon countries. But coming from Ireland, I've always had a problem with that label. So we have labeled them more accurately as the English-speaking liberal welfare states. So you'll see that in the picture for the UK is rather striking, but not a surprise to anyone who lived through it. And that is that you saw a very sharp rise in income inequality, very sharp in comparative context, and certainly compared to anything that had been seen before in the period since 1950 in the UK. You saw a very, very sharp increase in the years from 1980 to the early 90s, which were, of course, the Thatcher years. It's interesting that in most of the other countries, the level of inequality, the extent of inequality is certainly higher at the end of the period than it is at the start. But the pacing and the scale of the increase varies quite a lot from country to country. And indeed, my own native country of Ireland is the only one for which inequality isn't higher at the end than it was at the beginning. So that in some sense, and I should say that the US numbers at the top there, there are very particular problems with measuring trends in inequality in the US due to the nature of the official data that are produced there, that people tend to focus on first, that are quite limited in terms of what they capture and what they don't capture, in terms of they don't meet what one would require of a conventional income measure. And there have been various attempts to try and amend them to include, to be after tax rather than before tax, for example, that significantly affect the trend that you will see. So there are alternative series for the US that show really rather different pictures. And this is the best one that the US experts in our project could come up with, but just to be aware of that. But what you might be perhaps, I was certainly more surprised to see, is if you go to the traditionally low inequality Nordic countries and the Netherlands, in most of those you see a really sharp increase in inequality. Again, if you were to compare the 1980 with 2008. Again, differences across these countries in the pace, in when this inequality increase took place, and in the extent of the increase, with Sweden seeing a particularly pronounced increase, and particularly from the early 90s for reasons that we'll advert to in a minute. But if you were to simply say, where has inequality gone up most in the OECD over this 30-year period up to the crisis, you would be certainly throwing Finland and Sweden into that mix, along with the UK and the USA. A much more varied picture for what normally get categorized together as continental European welfare states, Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany, France, and Austria. Some showing significant increases, but others showing much more modest increases. Again, countries that get grouped together for both shared geography but also shared welfare systems in some very loose sense. A very much more mixed picture in the Mediterranean countries, where there were periods of increase in some countries, but others, notably Greece, see inequality as much lower at the end of the period, interestingly, than at the start, having started back in the era of post-dictatorship as really very unequal societies. Now, the largest changes that you will observe are unsurprisingly to be seen in the countries that transitioned rather painfully from state socialism to a market system from the late 80s, early 90s. Even here, so you see absolutely striking increases in inequality, sometimes very, very quickly. So, I mean, so in a sense, the range that you normally see for the Gini coefficient, this measure, is from about 0.2 to 0.4 in the high 0.3 somethings in the rich countries. And you can see that, you know, a country like Estonia essentially went from one end of that scale to the other in a very, very short space of time. But interesting differences across these transition, even across the Baltic countries, in terms of the scale of the increase, the pace of the increase, and what happened next. Because in Estonia, inequality then went on a downward trend, which was not the case in the other Baltic countries. But it's also important that some of the transition countries, if we want to label them that way, didn't see anything like as marked an increase in income inequality. And indeed, the Czech Republic, while it saw some increase, it was to a level that now leaves it as, on some of these measures, the most equal country in the European Union, displacing the Nordics. So that's all on the basis of when we try to measure, generally speaking with surveys, income inequality across the whole population. And there's some striking features to be seen there, particularly against the background that I described at the start, where for a significant period in the countries for which we had the data, which was mostly the richer of the rich countries, inequality was really rather stable in the 60s and 70s, certainly, in the 50s and 60s rather. But our understanding of income inequality has been transformed in a very, I think, in a way that should give hope to any graduate student who is laboring with their PC into the night with an Excel spreadsheet. Because our understanding of the world we live in and what's been happening has really, I think, been transformed by the creation of time series for income going to the share of income going to the very top of the distribution over the recent number of years, from about 10 years ago, by notably Tony Atkinson of this parish, Thomas Piketty, who has now become a superstar not just in the academic world, and his colleague Emmanuel Says. So they essentially drove this enterprise, which, you know, in some sense I think one can see as similar in nature to the enterprise that those of you working in OFI are engaged in, where our understanding of the world is transformed by, guess what, data. By a very clever combination of using data from tax statistics, which are reasonably effective in capturing what's happening at the top of the distribution, but haven't, for the most part, been used to study income inequality, because they don't capture much of the rest, particularly in going back far enough to the era when most people didn't pay any income tax. The combination of the window that tax data gives you on the top with national accounts data for aggregate income going to the personal sector or the household sector, which allows you to calculate one as a proportion of the other, that has underpinned the creation of this set of data, which are now readily accessible at the click of your mouse in the World Top Incomes database. And this is, and because of this, we're now in a position to talk about the 1% and the share of total income being, if you like, to be, I suppose, pejorative about it, being captured by the top 1% or even the top 0.1%. So we just didn't have that information, and it just wasn't visible, and now it is. And this, we are the 99% tag, and the Occupy movement and all the rest of it really reflects this awareness. So the striking thing about these data is that because of their nature, they go back a very long way, much further than we can go for the whole distribution with household survey data. So they go back 100 years or more, and Piketty has been able to go back with some of his data even further for France. So what they show on the big picture story, and again, OUP, 2 fine volumes, which capture the sharp distinction between what has happened in English-speaking countries by and large, which is that from about 1970, or maybe a bit later, having had a long period of decline through much of the 20th century, the share of income going to the very top has started, has gone into reverse, has really started rising. And over the period since then, in many of the English-speaking countries, and to a limited extent more recently in some of the other rich countries, you've seen this sharp increase in the share of total. Now this is income before tax, I should say, because that's what gets captured in these data most reliably, although there's work to be done to get at income after tax. But so that's the concept. But just to try and sort of give you the overview of what these data suggest, there has been some increase over the period that I was talking about earlier, from 1980 to 2007, up to the crisis. There's been some increase pretty much everywhere in terms of the OECD countries for which we have these data, which isn't all of them. But the increase is very much more modest in some countries than in others. And it's really pronounced, strikingly pronounced, in the UK and the USA. So when that number is 10%, that's 10% of total gross income. So the share going to the top has gone up that much in the USA over this period. Now you might, if you were paying very, very close attention to the graphs, you might be saying, well, that doesn't really fit entirely with what I saw earlier about overall inequality in the USA, where it was going up, but it didn't seem like it was going up much faster than some other places. And that captures one of the serious issues here, in that we are not at all confident, in fact we don't believe, that the surveys on which we rely for the most part for our estimates of overall household income, they don't capture the folk at the very top, by and large. They don't capture the top 1%, much less the top 0.1, for a whole variety of reasons, not least that when the interviewer goes to the gate and rings the bell and the dog comes out, you know, they don't get let in and they give up. But there have been efforts to try and combine these two data sources, and here in the UK, one of the official series on income inequality actually does its very best to combine knowledge from the tax data for the top with knowledge from surveys for the rest of the distribution. But again, that's not the case in the US. So the overall inequality in the US, as captured by those surveys and that Gini coefficient, seriously understates the increase in inequality that we know has been happening because of what we know has been happening at the very top. So when you pick up The Economist magazine a couple of weeks ago and the cover story is about the new aristocracy in the USA and how the elite, the wealthy, are now both much better positioned but also putting much more into securing the socioeconomic status that they have for their children by all sorts of means, which must be, you know, must keep the children very busy from a very early age with all their extracurricular activities and so on. That this is driven by the fact that this elite have a significantly larger share of the total pie. Now, you have to nuance it when you come to wealth, and it hasn't as yet entirely transmitted into increasing wealth inequality in a measurable way in all these countries, including here. But the assumption, certainly in Thomas Piketty's work, is that this increase in income inequality will inevitably feed into increasing wealth inequality and be a key driver of overall inequality in economic resources and access to them. So what's going on? It's a fairly familiar story in a sense, in that it's clear that for much of this period at least, in terms of overall inequality, what's happening is that the inequality in the distribution of income generated in the market, which is primarily earnings, has increased markedly in many countries. So it's wider earnings dispersion, wider dispersion in the earnings of individuals, but also wider dispersion in earnings going to households, partly because multiple earners tend to be more concentrated towards the upper parts of the distribution, and a range of other factors to do with income from other sources, income from self-employment, income from capital, and indeed age structures and household structures. But the key driver is what's happening to income in the market, from the market. But also, and particularly in the latter part, the OECD have put a lot of focus on the fact that in the period from early mid-80s to mid-late 90s, it certainly seemed to be increasing market income inequality that was the key component here. But in the latter part, it's also declining redistributive bite in some countries for a range of reasons that we can talk about. And of course, this doesn't then by any means adequately explain what's happening at the very top, where the key components, if you like, we've now moved to the stage where, having been able to monitor the overall share going to the top, there's been some very fascinating and it's sort of detective work, particularly with US data, which tends to be better than elsewhere, as to who are these folk at the top and where do their incomes come from. And what seems to be critical here is a combination of the income going to top managers, so corporate CEOs and their management teams, and that sort of percolating down the management chain a bit, but particularly at in the executive suite, if you like, the remuneration, the total remuneration package of top executives has absolutely ballooned, and you'll have seen statistics that get very regularly reported as to what's the relationship between the remuneration of the top executive and the factory floor worker or the ordinary worker, and that ratio has ballooned from, oh, it could have been 7 or 10 or 12 not so long ago, to now in the US for top Fortune 100 firms being of the order of 120. And interestingly, that concern about that sort of number drove an almost successful referendum campaign in Switzerland, where they having a interestingly democratic process, a referendum on whether the state should put a cap on that ratio was debated and voted on, and a very substantial proportion voted in favour, although not a majority. And the cap they had in mind was if I recall, was of the order of 12 or 14. So way out of sync with what's actually happening in the market. So that's one element. Another element is what's happening in the finance sector. So it's both the growth in the importance of the finance sector, particularly in the US and the UK, but also the way in which that people at the top in the finance sector get rewarded, and the extent to which, again, they capture the increased returns going to the financial sector more generally. And then you have returns going to what you might, so there's say sports stars, movie stars, media stars of various sorts. Their remuneration has ballooned as they have been able to appeal to a wider and wider market as well. So there are some speculations as to the economic forces going on here that might be driving this sort of change in reward for the top. Again, you can talk about the impact of technology and globalization, which certainly are affecting what's happening to rewards in the market more generally. But a number of people, including Tony Atkinson, have speculated that changing norms about what's appropriate have also played a part. So I'm going to rush rather rapidly through what happened in the recession, and again, there's a very good OUP book on this, which I can only recommend, which actually didn't have data through the recession. It had data for the first 2 or 3 years of the recession. But strikingly, this is a chart from the OECD, which shows what happened to inequality in income from the market, which is the orange bars, and it's no great surprise that inequality in the market went up rather markedly in many countries in the crisis. But the blue bars show what happened to inequality in disposable income after taxes, after direct taxes were taken off market income, and after cash transfers were received by households. And you can see that the picture is rather different, and that this very much ameliorated, cushioned the increase in income inequality that was seen in the market. And with the result that in a significant minority of countries, inequality actually fell, and in many it didn't increase by much. Those are the corresponding numbers from a European source that shows, again, as many countries almost with inequality declining as rising in the crisis. So you have to be very careful about thinking through the impact of recession on inequality, because apart from anything else, one of the immediate impacts tends to be on profits and income towards the top. And secondly, the capacity of welfare states now to cushion the impact of recessions, at least initially, is very much greater than it was. So what I think has to be emphasized is that while there is, in some loose sense, a generalized trend towards increasing income inequality, this has been rather varied in timing and in degree from country to country, and in some instances has really come in what you might think of as episodes. So if you want to regard the Thatcher era in the UK as an episode where inequality simply ratcheted up very substantially, and has gone up rather modestly since then. It's gone up a little, but not very markedly. Again, in Canada, you see a similar, very distinct period. In the Scandinavian countries, likewise. So while market forces are clearly implicated here, the response of countries in terms of their policies, not least their tax and welfare policies, is pretty central. So what I just want to talk about briefly is where a lot of the emphasis, as I said at the start, has been in terms of what does this mean? Why when people, so you have the Occupy movement talking about the 99%, but what you have politicians talking about is very much the squeezed middle. Now you might say, well, that's because where the votes are, and that of course is where the votes are and why they're talking about it. But here in the political debate that we're now in the middle of, but for some years, and in President Obama's recent State of the Union speech, in Davos, Governor Janet Yellen of the Fed, they're all talking about inequality and the squeezed middle. The snag about this is, and perhaps of course this is one of the reasons the term has become so widely used and popular, is that it means a very wide variety of different things, and in some sense it can mean almost what you want it to mean. It can mean the middle of the income distribution. It can mean it can mean the middle class, which again, the middle class can mean almost anything you want it to mean depending on who you talk to. And in some of the rhetoric, it's actually talking about people who would be in the upper third of the income distribution. Much of the middle class is well up the income distribution, and yet our feature when we talk about who's being squeezed. And the other aspect of course, is what do we mean by squeezed? Do we mean that their share of total income is going down? They're not getting the same share of the cake that they did? Sometimes it's talking about the middle, the number of households in the middle is being squeezed as people get pushed to the two extremes. I had a journalist on to me the other day wanted to talk about the global middle class, which was a very, as we talked about it, it became clear just what an odd notion that was. But there, at a global level, the interest is in the increase in the size of what gets characterized as the middle class. So you can think about income, you can think about income shares, you can think about relativities or absolute levels of income. Are the middle class becoming less prosperous? Or are they getting squeezed in terms of their capacity to afford the things that they thought they were going to be able to afford, like housing in London? So just to finish by showing you some numbers on this. And this again is for OECD countries drawing on a range of databases. So this is saying what has happened. One of the ways that people have tried to capture this notion of the middle is to look at households whose income is between 3/4 of the middle of the distribution, the median, and 150%. And say, again, Tony Atkinson with Andrew Brandolini has done some work with that sort of definition. So if you look at a range of countries, you can see that there are indeed, in the majority of the countries shown there, you can find a significant decline in the numbers in the proportion of households who are clustered around the middle in that sense. Marked decline in some countries, the UK not particularly being one of them, with a relatively modest decline. You can, as I say, look at it in terms of shares. Is it the income share that we're talking about? That if more is going to the top and the bottom are perhaps being protected, perhaps, then the middle must be seeing less. Again, if you look at the US and the UK on the right, you will see that there is certainly a decline in share going to the deciles in the middle of the distribution, however you want to characterize those, and that you see this in more countries than not. But I think the note I'll end on is what I think is actually rather more salient for many households, and that's what's happening to their incomes in terms of purchasing power, which need bear only a very loose relationship to overall inequality or their share of the total. So if you care to look at the right-hand side at the UK and the USA, this shows for the middle of the distribution, the bulk of the distribution, those deciles in the middle, what happened to their income, their average income, adjusted for prices. And you can see that, you see rather contrasting stories for the UK and the USA, which is a note I'll comfortably end on. And that is that in the UK, from the period from 1985 to the crisis, there was very healthy growth in real incomes, in the purchasing power of income, for households in and around the middle. And in fact, that was true for much of the period when income inequality was rising sharply. You did see that very marked dip in the crisis from which we're currently just starting to recover. But if you look at the USA, what's really striking there is not the decline in purchasing power of the middle in the crisis, but it's what was happening beforehand. So for the 30 years, 25 years up to the crisis, there were only a few periods in which ordinary, this tends to get couched in very sort of normatively laden terms like the ordinary worker or the ordinary family or the typical family, but they didn't see much improvement in their living standards as measured crudely by real income adjusted for prices, for much of the period up to the crisis. And that's what's really striking about the USA. Now, it's not clear that in pure timing terms that bears a particularly strong relationship to the timing of increasing income inequality. In other words, living standards were not necessarily most stagnant in the US in the periods when inequality was rising most rapidly, at least as captured by these overall income inequality measures. And that's equally true in the USA, where, or in the UK rather, where over the period when inequality was rising most rapidly, there were improvements, significant improvements in real living standards. So what we have to do, I think, here is really step back and try and tease out the nature of the relationship between overall income inequality, particularly what's happening at the very top, and the capacity of economies to generate improvements in living standards for middle and lower households in the distribution. Because it's interesting that the concern now, and I will stop, the concern now is about inequality undermining recovery and underpinning what gets labeled secular stagnation, because in some sense the economies are not generating enough demand because the income is sticking at the top where the marginal propensity to consume tends to be low. But looking over a 30-year period in the US, you would be much more concerned about deeper relationships between how the income is being generated, the sectors the income is being generated, where it's being generated, the concentration on finance, for example, and the distributional outcomes that has, both in terms of top income shares, but also then that in some sense there's a failure to generate what would have been expected to be adequate improvements in living standards for ordinary workers, and thus feeding into concern about their capacity to do the same for their children and see the, if you like, the American dream in reality. And the concern is, of course, that, as in many other things, what we see first in the US, we may see down the line here. So I look forward to your reactions and to a good discussion. Thank you for your attention.